And I've tried to wrap that up since Trump was re-elected. In fact, the day he was re-elected, I published on it, saying we would see a shift from economic policy, which we all understand. Anyone watching this knows what economic policy is by different area: fiscal, monetary, FX, trade, energy, yada, 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 to economic statecraft. And the key difference between policy and statecraft is with statecraft, you combine all of them together like fingers and a thumb into a fist. And it can be offensive or defensive, but you're doing it with a purpose. And you ask yourself this question: what is GDP for? That's my big shtick. What is GDP for? Once you start answering that question, how you do everything else and how they all line up is obvious to you, because you have to do X, Y, Z, regardless of what the rules say or markets say. But until you ask yourself that question, you don't join anything up, and nothing that you're doing has any strategic sense. So we're now in a world of economic statecraft. And in fact, we're moving rapidly along the spectrum of economic statecraft from defensive to offensive, and into whole new isms, like you're hearing neo-imperialism being thrown around at the moment for good reason. So it's absolutely at the cutting edge of economic statecraft where we are now. I mean, you're very kind, thank you, to refer to the fact that since basically 2014, 2015, I started writing on this theme. 2016, absolutely nailing it down and saying, look, the liberal world order can collapse. They have collapsed twice in the past. The path we're on now will lead to a repeat of that collapse, because we have a global paradigm whereby the only thing propping everything up, if you look behind the back of the stage, is American military power. And the economic and financial system that America is doing is best to prop up undermines its military power, because it doesn't have the factories to build the military goods to maintain that kind of power on a sustained basis. Other people are going to see that, are going to rearm. Power abhors a vacuum. And you're going to end up with a US-China clash, with others siding with China and some being forced to side with the US, and it is increasingly being forced to side with it. And the world will split, the liberal world order will collapse, and everything that you think you understand about how markets work will come tumbling down. So that's been the big picture view. And, long story short, we are of one mind on that, because the US is the one who built the liberal world order. As I said, America imposed it, collaborated to build it with others. Although remember, for a long time, it was only around a third of the world that was in it. 1/3 was communist, and the other third was what we used to call non-aligned. So we only got the whole world lined up behind it, ostensibly, from around 2001 onwards. It's a relatively new development in historical terms, even if for someone who's young using Bloomberg, that seems like all of their life. But once you take that away, America is free to, lose influence in some respects. Absolutely. You take the gloves off, people see you for who you really are. You're not loved, perhaps, in the way that you were. But Machiavelli said, is it better to be loved or feared? And it's better to be feared if you have to choose between the two.
If you have to choose.
Well, hasn't that changed in the past couple of days or the past couple of weeks? Yes, you can look at Ukraine and say maybe that's changing in a way that doesn't favor Ukraine or doesn't favor Europe or the West, etc. That's a whole separate debate. Let's just put that one on ice for now. But in Venezuela, well, that's, the Don Roe doctrine, in effect. That's America basically staking claim to Latin America and all the Western Hemisphere again. In fact, Trump overnight, as we're recording this, has just said that the USMCA is irrelevant. So, all manner of things are going to flow from that Don Roe doctrine that we can unpack. And even in the Middle East, where Iran potentially, that regime could fall. I mean, we rewind to the middle of...
It's crazy.
Or even September. Yeah, it's crazy. But September 2023, you've got Iran encircling Israel with a whole host of powers. You've got Russia at war with Ukraine. You've got China in Asia. You've got Venezuela in Latin America, of course, with a Hezbollah and Iranian presence, and a Russian presence and a Chinese presence in Venezuela, which everyone in the intelligence community knew about. Suddenly, Latin America, it's not settled yet. It's not done and dusted. But America has basically put down the marker and said, ours. Ukraine, they've handed the ball to Europe and said, yours. And you need to copy our economic model to be able to succeed in that particular task. Then they can pivot to Asia. The Middle East, if Iran topples, The Middle East is never resolved, trust me. You solve a problem and you create a problem. But America is infinitely better placed from a geopolitical perspective right now than it was just a few months ago.
And the key line that he wrote in there, which I immediately grabbed because I thought it nailed it, was he said the confusion comes from mistaking prioritization for abandonment. And so I think a lot of people have said, this is the U.S. pulling back, and not only are they pulling back because they want to, but they're pulling back because they have to. They've been defeated on the global stage. They can no longer compete. Their military is no longer what it used to be. They're finally realizing it, and they're retreating back to their own neighborhood, and they're going to try to throw their weight around in their own neighborhood. And to me, this is just it's a misinterpretation. And so when Michael McNair said that, I thought it perfectly summed it up because, in some ways, coming back and focusing on your own neighborhood and strengthening your own backyard allows you to then force project to an even greater extent if and when you decide to do so.
That's absolutely clear. Okay, it's made that basically on the record again now. But here's the key point. The people who thought that that wasn't a Trump plan now say, yeah, but the other part of the plan is he's going to give Europe and Ukraine to Russia and is going to give all of Asia to China. No, that's not how spheres of influence work. Not if you actually really, really want to maintain primacy, which Trump clearly does and the US clearly does. The way you do that, if you've ever played Risk, which is what we're basically playing now, you hold your territory and then you hold the borders of the other continent that the other team has so that they don't basically have the set and get more powerful. I mean, it's that simple in board game terms. So you don't let Asia fall to China because that will in time make them more important than you. Because rich as the Americas are together, Asia, more populous, can probably do far better, particularly given the industrial head start that China has now, which is huge and should never be underplayed. I actually think there's a distinct parallel between where Trump is now and President Gorbachev of the Soviet Union. And I say that.
Interesting. I know.
I say that because
Go ahead.
He inherited a superpower in 1985, and it was completely stagnant. The Soviet Union was a superpower. It was fantastic at producing military stuff. It was terrible at producing consumer stuff. They had a command economy which didn't have any issues with profitability because it didn't exist. It was basically do it. So talk about fiat, just do that. But they destroyed value with most of what they were making. But they could flood the world Kalashnikovs with good, cheap tanks, with reasonable fighter jets, et cetera, et cetera. And they controlled around a third of the world's population. This was a serious foe for the US, a serious opponent. And you'd had periods of confrontation and, almost warfare, periods of proxy warfare, and periods of denial. But overall, of course, they were enemies. So Gorbachev comes in and the Soviet Union, the Communist Party, appoint him because they recognize they need to reform. They need to move towards embracing consumer goods to keep people happy alongside the military goods. Now, I'm going to describe in the piece I put out in much more detail how the Soviet economy worked because I studied that.
That's why I love this. This is why I love talking to you. You can go ahead.
Okay, well, I thought it was my sparkling personality.
No, this is great.
So basically, I'm not going to go into finite detail now because everyone will fall asleep. But the whole point is the system couldn't be reformed. They tried partial reforms. They didn't work. Then they had to accelerate them. And gradually, the system just collapsed. In fact, there was an attempted coup against Gorbachev, but people were saying, let's rewind the clock.
Yeah.
Because once you started to play around with the command economy and introduce market mechanisms to it, everything collapses. It's like a table where you need to change all four legs at once. But you can't do all four at once. So you take away one, the table falls over and you lose all your food. Okay? So it was a disaster. Then we got radical market reformers that came in and really decimated Russia, and that's a whole different story. But the Gorbachev era is prescient because what he was trying to do was introduce basically glasnost, which is radical transparency, and perestroika, which is reforms. Well, Trump is all about glasnost, freedom of speech. Everyone can say everything, even if it's offensive. It's a controversial political point, but there's a parallel there. And he is trying perestroika. He's trying to take a US economy, which is all about consumption, and make it more about the military.
It's reverse perestroika. It's reverse perestroika is what it is.
He needs to move towards a more command economy whilst not blowing up the consumer side. Now, again, I don't want to get into the intricacies of that, but the system works in reverse. For example, once you start saying, what is GDP for? You start asking, well, what's the Fed for? And that brings us to all the hoo-ha with Powell at the moment, okay? What are interest rates for? Who are they for? You start controlling everything and commanding everything, and then market forces can disappear and you go too far, right? So he has to make sure he doesn't blow the whole thing up the way that Gorbachev did. When they wrote about Latin America and the Dunroe Doctrine, they made very clear they want cheap commodities from Latin America.
Yes.
Who doesn't want cheap commodities? That's good old-fashioned Yankee imperialismo, okay? Imperialism. But they add in the text quite specifically, we want this as part of a reindustrialization of Latin America in parallel with a reindustrialization of America, which is actually in line with Adam Smith's original concept, whereby, and even David Ricardo, whereby you industrialize in your own economy and you trade at the margin. You don't invest all your capital in a cheap country and produce everything there and then borrow from them to buy their goods and be a consumer, not a producer. So what they want actually is an inclusive, more fair, more equitable imperialism, if you will, which demolishes the neoliberal, liberal-based order, which was a neoliberal-based order.
So 2 points I would make on this. Number one, and then finally, the innovation. Well, this has kind of gone overlooked, I think, but there is a small but extremely powerful department within what's now called the Department of War, called the Office of Strategic Capital. And this is essentially the way this office is going to act as the quarterback to coordinate all the different resources and organizations and branches of the United States, both on a private and public basis, to bring funding to companies and industries and market sectors that the United States deems critical to national security and economic renaissance. And they are going to fund these industries and these companies, going forward, almost as if it is a national security issue. Not almost, as if it is a national security issue. And this goes towards innovation. It goes towards manufacturing. It goes towards defense. And we've actually figured out a way to participate in this, thankfully, because I think this is one of the biggest tailwinds that markets are going to see over the next 5 or 10 years. And it's one of the biggest tailwinds I have seen in doing this for 25 years.
I mean, really, it's just a logical extension of what you were just talking about with strategic capital. Because for those who don't know what they are, letters of marque are something in the US Constitution, which can still be issued by Congress now, which effectively, and other countries like the UK used, or the England used them long beforehand, where you effectively legalize piracy. So, some of our greatest mariners in English naval history were effectively pirates. And we said to them,
privateers, right?
And privateers, go and raid the Spanish boats for all the gold. You give 20%, 30% for the government, you get to keep the rest. What are you doing? You're incentivizing the private sector and get out there and do what your Navy is incapable of doing. So I still think that there's a logical argument for the US to do that at some point when they just say, right, we need to interdict X, Y, or Z. Or if they start saying Russian oil, okay, anyone who can manage to seize a Russian oil tanker, you get to keep half the cargo. Or you get to keep half the profits when it's sold. Okay, does it have downsides? Yeah, absolutely. Are there risks involved with that? No brainer. But if you need to get something done geopolitically when you don't have the state capacity to do it, but the private sector could more efficiently motivate itself and militarize itself to a degree and get out there, why wouldn't you do that?